Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this workshop. I'd have the next slide, please. I have 15 years of experience as an academic, 25 years experience in the biotech, biopharma industry, everything from drug discovery to clinical decision support systems. But I'd like to speak in my new position as the CEO of Accelerated Cure Project, which many of you may not know, although some, thanks to PCORI, are beginning to learn more about us. Accelerated Cure Project was founded by an engineer who discovered or was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. I think that's very important because he came in with a completely blank view of biomedical research, but had lived through the open source movement in software and hardware. Our major activity is that we have a biorepository of extensive clinical data and samples from 3,200 people who've contributed at 10 clinical sites around the United States. We make those samples and data relatively freely available to researchers all around the world, with one proviso, is that they bring the data back to Accelerated Cure Project. So I'd like to talk primarily from my experience with Accelerated Cure Project about what has made this successful and what are the elements, could I have the next slide, that have contributed. So in answer to the question, does data sharing present a particular disadvantage for companies, etc., I would say that multiple companies listed there, and probably more, I didn't spend much time looking, have accessed ACP's clinical data and biosamples and are willing to share the resulting data because of the substantial cost savings of accessing the data and biosamples. And it speaks actually to many of these companies are small, venture-backed or moving out of that era. And I think this quote, which wasn't generated by us, but came from a recent Scientific American blog, which we suddenly discovered, basically doing independent sample and data collection for small companies is enormously expensive. And so if you can access cheaply the samples and data that you need, you may be prepared to contribute the results back to a central database. Next slide, please. In our experience, what measures might be taken by all stakeholders to overcome the challenges experienced in sharing data? I believe it's the creation of an end-to-end solution infrastructure that creates a compelling value proposition for sharing the data. And I'll talk about the last part of that in my next slide. But first, I should say that I think the reason ACP has been successful is it represents a sort of honest broker, patient-founded role that engages investigators and avoids the creation of a single investigator-centric system. One of the things that really excited me when I looked at the organization three years ago was that the engineers had decided that the key thing was to engage patients in order to get the data. And so the organization paid for a study coordinator at each of the 10 clinical sites. This is enormously important for truly informed consent. It's important for patient engagement, and it's important for the quality of the clinical data that is collected. We have a data and sample distribution oversight committee, which doesn't so much critique what people want to do with the samples or data, but does critique the quality of their analytical methods, because we want good data to come back to the repository, whether the experiment is successful or fails, and whether there's a publication or not. We do allow a period of time that's negotiated with every material transfer agreement or data agreement that enables IP protection, because it's true that nothing really happens to impact patients without IP protection in the life science area. And I said as well, I think we've demonstrated or created the value proposition. Could I have the next slide? And so in answer to another question that was proposed, I think you need to create a system that delivers something back to the investigators and the research community and patients that could only come from data sharing and has substantial unique value. And one of the most recent things we've been doing, because we realized with 80 different research groups to date working on our data and sample and 30 research groups continuing data back, that our database may know more about multiple sclerosis patients than anybody has ever known before. And so we're working on a front-end tool to access the repository that brings together all of the data and links them by the patient ID to create these things we call Datastax, where the colors represent the individual research studies. So you'll see in those two data sets, there's some of the data links up with 5 studies, some of the data from the green study links up with 4 studies. But this is a virtual collaboration between groups that may be industry groups or academic groups all over the world. And I think that showing people this, as we have done to our own investigators and others, as the tool is in development, makes them go, wow, this is exactly why we created an open access database.
Thanks, Robert. Your time is up. Great.
Thanks.
Now we'll open the floor for questions.